I'd like to welcome you all to this event and to this special occasion. Just one word about the Middle East discussion group. Many student groups begin, and then the people who initiate them graduate or leave, whatever, and the group dies. And one of the things about the Middle East discussion group is that it's been able to sustain itself now for 3 or 4 years. And I hope that it can continue, because it's really added nice element here and student involvement in these issues. All right, with no further ado, it's a pleasure to introduce Dylan Williams, who's the Director of Government Affairs for J Street. He can talk more about J Street, but I think it's fair to say that after 5 or 6 years now, that J Street has emerged as a player on Middle East questions, particularly the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, and represents an element in the Jewish community that maybe it was there, but it wasn't organized and didn't have the kind of voice that it has. So is part of something that I think is really important. Dylan joined J Street after working at the Council of Foreign Relations. He was on the staff of Olympia Snow, a moderate Republican from Maine, working on trade and immigration issues. His expertise is in international affairs and law, and he's a member of the New York Bar. And we welcome you and turn the floor over to you.
Thank you very much, Professor.
You're welcome.
It's really a pleasure to be here. I thank the discussion group. I thank the center. Special thank you to Nate to helping organize all this. I was warned last night that there is a Colorado version of Shabbat where people tend to, as Friday progresses, go up to the mountains and pray. And that struck me as making sense at the time, but then about an hour later I had half a glass of wine and nearly fainted, and so what that means is with such an impressive group here today, I have to assume either you are extremely dedicated to this topic or, like me, that this is as high as you go. So either way, I feel like I'm among kindred spirits, and I feel very, very welcome here. Why don't I start off with a little bit about J Street, the organization, and then I'll discuss how we view the current situation both in the United States and on the ground in the Middle East in terms of the possibilities and trajectory of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, and then spend most of our time answering any questions that you may have on any related subject. J Street is 5 years old now. We were literally founded in our founder's basement with 2 employees, and in that time we've grown to a staff of 50 nationwide, 180,000 supporters, about 50 local chapters around the country, 45 J Street U chapters on college campuses. And by the way, if you're interested in that at all, please come talk to me and my colleague, Gordon Gladstone, who is our regional director for grassroots and field in this area, and a cabinet of over 700 rabbis that advise us. J Street's work is organized into 3 areas. First, there's the grassroots. Second, there's the lobby team, which I lead. We have 4 full-time federally registered lobbyists doing the underhanded things that lobbyists do. And then perhaps I think most distinctively and also most controversially, we decided to get engaged in the political game by having our own political action committee, a PAC. And I'll explain a little bit more later about why it was so necessary to engage in essentially the money politics that our government is essentially run on. We were founded because there was a large portion of the engaged Jewish American pro-Israel community. And by that I mean people who attended synagogue, went to events at their Jewish community center, were a member of their local Jewish federation, maybe went to AIPAC conferences, maybe even went to Washington a couple times to lobby their senators on behalf of advancing the US-Israel relationship. But a growing segment of these folks were becoming deeply uncomfortable with the policies that these groups were advocating to Congress and which Congress was in turn putting forward as either laws, resolutions, or letters, and specifically on the issue of advancing a two-state resolution and dealing with the consequences of the occupation of the West Bank, as well as the conditions in the Gaza Strip. A large swath of Jewish Americans oppose the occupation and some of the policies that come along with it. A supermajority of Jewish Americans vehemently support a two-state resolution to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. And what J Street has managed to do is give a voice to that portion of the Jewish American community, and in addition, bring in 100,000 or more Jewish Americans who wanted to advocate for Israel in the past, but never have done so because they were never comfortable with the message that older existing lobby groups in Washington were delivering to Congress. You know, we've done 4 years of polling, or 4 rounds of polling in our existence, and I'll cover that more in detail later. But what we've learned is that, you know, 80% of Jewish Americans or more support a two-state resolution and want the United States to take a leadership role in it. This is fundamentally different than the message and the focus of the groups that have existed in Washington, D.C. before us. And that's why I think our growth has been so tremendous and we've made such a splash. It's not that we are strategic geniuses, it's that there was such a need for this in our community. Now, let's take a look at what the current situation is, and let me explain what our view is. First of all, there is an incredible sense of urgency among those who examine this issue. First of all, it's important to realize that as President Obama begins his second term, the question of whether it's even possible to achieve a two-state resolution to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict will be decided or not, most likely, during President Obama's second term, perhaps even in the first 2 years of his second term. And why is that? Well, right now on the ground, there's a status quo that is simply unsustainable. And it's somewhat masked by, at least in Israel, a sense of calm, a fake sense of calm and stability. But what we see is that tensions and attitudes on the West Bank are hardening against Israel and against the occupation. While last year was the most peaceful in terms of attacks against Israelis emanating out of the West Bank, no Israelis were actually killed from or in the West Bank in 2012, the number of incidents did increase. We also have a growing sense among the Palestinian population, and I would add it's a legitimate sense, that peace may not be possible, and the prospects for peace are slipping away. Similarly, on the Israeli side, Israelis see often a hardening rhetoric coming out of both the West Bank and certainly out of the Gaza Strip, which is under the control of Hamas. Israelis are afraid of more violence coming out of the Gaza Strip, as well as out of its north from Hezbollah. And Israelis are also very worried about an increasing international isolation that is coming both of its own accord as populations, particularly in Europe, have become more and more distraught over the situation in the West Bank and the Gaza Strip, and also, legally speaking, as a consequence of the Palestinian approach to the United Nations last year, in which the Palestinians achieved non-member observer state status. That has the potential to have very serious legal consequences for Israeli officials and the Israeli government as a whole, should the Palestinians choose to submit themselves to the jurisdiction of international bodies like the International Criminal Court, for example. So there is a real false sense of stability and the real potential for chaos to erupt in the region, or I should say between Israel and Palestine. Needless to say, chaos has erupted in the region as we look at the lingering consequences and, in fact, inflaming results of the Arab awakening, particularly in Syria, right up against Israel's northern border. Now, this urgency requires leadership from the United States to deal with. And why is the United States so essential? At the end of the day, for all of the false starts, faults, and imbalance at different times leading towards various parties of United States policy in this region, the United States is still the only country, still the only government that enjoys sufficient trust and influence with the two parties to actually mediate a deal. Certainly the Israelis are not going to look to anyone else. Even their closest allies in Europe are not fully trusted to the extent that the United States is by the Israeli mainstream. On the Palestinian side, while there may be other countries that the Palestinians and the Arab states trust more than the United States, there is still enough of a relationship that the Palestinians would, should the United States put forward proposals that it deems fair, be able to proceed under a peace process organized by the United States. So United States leadership is essential. The problem is, because the United States must act, it's incumbent upon us to make whatever action the United States takes meaningful. And especially for the last 18 months to 2 years, the strategy of the Obama administration was not particularly helpful. There was an insistence on direct talks, that only returning the parties to the negotiating table face to face was the only way to proceed, and that's simply false. First of all, historically, we know that some of the greatest advancements in negotiations, and including between Israel and Arab parties, happened not through direct negotiations, but through shuttle diplomacy and proximity talks. Specifically, I'm thinking of Camp David Accords and the peace with Egypt. In addition, it's clear now there is such a deficit of trust and confidence on both sides of the other party's intent and willingness to actually conclude a two-state resolution that simply leaving them at a blank table would produce nothing but further acrimony and certainly no progress. So it boils down to, can the American government credibly lead on this issue? And that in turn gets us to the preeminent question, which is, will this government do so? Will the Obama administration do so? And how can we increase the prospects that it will actually take bold action? And that comes down to, that brings us out of the region itself actually and into Washington, D.C., and moreover into each of these local communities. The question of whether our government will act is one of whether the Obama administration and its supporters in Congress perceive there to be enough political space for them to actually launch a new, bold initiative for peace. Now, I referenced the polling that we've done. We've done 4 rounds of polling every year. It's fairly consistent. Within Washington, D.C., there is this consensus that has grown over a number of decades that if, as a president or a member of Congress or someone aspiring to be a political player or even a policy position within the government, that if you fail to adhere to the somewhat right-wing, hawkish orthodoxy regarding Israel, Israel's relationship with the Palestinians, and the United States relationship with Israel, that you will pay a consequence. For members of Congress, that consequence is believed to be massive campaign funding against you in your subsequent election, or other headache further down the line. And I think as those of you who were aware of or read something about the Hagel hearings, which took place, indicate exactly that kind of intimidation, and the word is intimidation, that can come about by those who try to enforce that orthodoxy with a small o. J Street is set about to prove that that's not the case. First of all, Jewish Americans, those who many of these hawkish politicians claim to be speaking for, and many of these groups claim to be speaking for, overwhelmingly support a more balanced, moderate, and productive U.S. stance towards resolving the conflict. I mentioned that more than 80% of Jewish Americans support U.S. leadership towards a two-state solution. That's a good figure. It's a little soft, right? That can mean different things to different people. So in our polling, we turn up the heat. We ask them, would you support the United States putting forth its own plan, its own parameters, whatever you want to call it? 76% of Jewish Americans support that notion. That's very different than the message that you typically get in Washington, where you constantly have groups saying the United States cannot impose peace. Well, of course the United States can't impose peace, nor should it. But what the United States can do, like any mediator, is put forward productive proposals that the two sides then negotiate further and eventually agree to. If you ask Jewish Americans about the content of what a two-state resolution actually looks like, the support is, I think, even more astonishing than what the Washington consensus would believe. 79% of Jewish Americans would support a resolution to the conflict, a peace plan based on the lines of the Geneva Initiative. Now, let me explain what those are. Those are borders, internationally recognized borders, based on the 1967 lines, plus mutually agreed swaps to allow most Israeli settlers currently situated just east of Jerusalem to remain in internationally recognized Israel while creating a Palestinian sovereign state in the West Bank and Gaza. That means acknowledging a right of return for Palestinians to the new Palestinian state with compensation for those who have legitimate claims to property lost inside Israel proper. It means, and I think this is the most shocking one, the one that is most at odds with what you hear coming out of Congress, it means that the Arab neighborhoods of East Jerusalem would form the Palestinian capital. 79% of American Jews support that. That is not the message that Washington has gotten. Furthermore, if you ask Jewish Americans about process, would you support the United States publicly disagreeing with both parties when necessary to advance that two-state resolution? 69% of American Jews agree with that. More than 2/3 of American Jews want our government not to reflexively parrot the talking points of one side. They want our government to push both publicly to actually make the compromises necessary to achieve peace. Why do Jewish Americans support that? Jewish Americans support that because a two-state resolution is the only resolution that can guarantee the survival of an Israel which is both democratic and Jewish in character. Let me be clear about something. I'm a Zionist. I believe in historical Zionism, and I am a supporter of the State of Israel, a State of Israel that both has a Jewish character and, yes, a Jewish majority, but is also democratic. If you lose either of those pillars, the Zionist dream is dead, and the State of Israel, as we know it, ceases to exist. The two-state resolution is not a favor to the Palestinians. You know, I consider myself a supporter of human rights, and I am delighted that the work we do at J Street, if we're successful, will result in the Palestinians realizing their national aspirations and their dreams of sovereignty and the ability to control their own destiny in a way they cannot now. But for the vast majority of our supporters, and I imagine for the vast majority of our community, that is a happy byproduct of the work. We are in this to save Israel as we know it. And that's why so many Jewish Americans have begun to distance themselves from the hawkish views and policies articulated by the older pro-Israel groups in Washington and begun to gravitate towards J Street's thinking. And we're also seeing real impact in Congress. I mentioned our PAC. You know, it's one thing to tell members of Congress that Jewish Americans are with them on policy, or I should say with where the president should be on policy. But it's another thing to translate that into actual political comfort. So members of Congress, so the administration feel comfortable enough to take the actions that are necessary. And that's where our PAC comes into play. There is this, as I said, a sense in Washington that massive political retribution awaits you if you fail to toe the hawkish line. What we've shown through our PAC, which in the last two cycles was the largest pro-Israel PAC, is that that's just not true. In the last cycle, 2012, we dispersed $1.8 million to 71 congressional candidates. 70 of those congressional candidates won their races. That includes 7 senators. That $1.8 million represents 1/3 of all pro-Israel PAC money that went to congressional candidates. And it represents 1/2 of all pro-Israel PAC money that went to Democratic candidates for Congress. We've already demonstrated that there is not significant political retribution to doing anything other than towing the most hawkish line on Israel. Now, that's not to say that there aren't people who try to create that headache. We know that there is a vocal minority on the right wing of our community that will throw everything they have at candidates, at the president, at Chuck Hagel, because they want to very much enforce this orthodoxy and push back on the notion that they can no longer intimidate people in Washington. And some of these people are fairly well financed. And in the last election, we saw tens of millions of dollars, maybe even $100 million of funding to cast the president, to some extent his party, as less than supportive of Israel. That effort not only failed, it actually backfired. You know, the president was reelected with 70% of support from the Jewish American community. That is exactly the average that Democratic candidates for Congress or for president, I should say, have gotten for the last 40 years, every election since exit polling began. Moreover, where Jewish Americans actually did see ads, TV ads, radio ads, or print ads, attacking either the president or a local candidate on the issue of Israel, that Jewish American was more likely to end up voting for the candidate than not. It actually increased the likelihood that they would vote for the candidate that was being attacked. Jewish Americans have a profound distaste for the partisanization of this issue. And that's probably because Jewish Americans are not only policy-wise with where J Street is and with where the president should be, and probably in his heart wants to be, but also because, as we like to say, Jewish Americans are people too. We vote on the same things that other Americans vote on. In our polling, we asked Jewish Americans to rank the top 2 issues on which they decided their vote, and we give them a menu of about 10 or 12 issues. Israel typically comes in number 7 or 8, at most with about 10% of Jewish Americans saying that that's one of the top 2 issues on which they vote. The top 4 issues are always the economy, healthcare, education, jobs. I mean, that is what Americans vote on, the bread and butter issues that Americans vote on. Interestingly, I just want to point out, Iran comes in dead last. Less than 1% of Jewish Americans say they decide their vote based on where a candidate stands or is saying about the issue of Iran and its nuclear program. So what we see going forward is a strong case that we've made, that others in the community have made, that the political space does exist for this president to really initiate a new attempt at actually concluding a 2-state resolution. Whether he will or not still very much remains to be seen. In the past week, we've been on a little bit of a roller coaster in terms of the announcements and hints that have been made. A few days ago, it was made known that the president is traveling to Israel and to other states in the region, as well as the West Bank, sometime in late March. The Israeli press is saying March 20th. And the initial report said one of the items he will be there to discuss is reinvigorating the peace process. Subsequent to that, we saw some downplaying by the White House and some of their surrogates about the prospects that the White House or that the president will do anything significant on the peace process or say anything significant on the peace process while he's there. But while we understand that it's very unlikely for the president to arrive in Jerusalem with new American parameters in his hand that he puts on the table, the president would be wise, at the very least, to put the congressional seal of approval on Secretary Kerry's stated intentions to restart the peace process in a new way, in a way that doesn't reflexively focus on the need for direct negotiations or simply getting the parties back to the table. So that's where we are in terms of the policy landscape. And with that, I think we should open up to questions.
Thank you for a very interesting discussion. So here's how it goes. First, we welcome all comments and questions, period. I will limit comments to 2 minutes, and we'll be rather strict on that for those, just historically, on as questions and answers on this issue. So I open up the floor. Who would like to? I know there's got to be questions from this group.
Yeah, following the election results in Israel, who do you see are the most likely candidates for the foreign minister position in Israel? And do you think that there is promise for fruitful negotiations at the ministerial level?
An excellent question. You know, the exact composition of the coalition that Prime Minister Netanyahu will form is still up in the air. One thing we do know is that it doesn't look like, just like the elections weren't a referendum on the Palestinian question and Israeli attitudes towards a 2-state resolution, the formation of his coalition is also unlikely to be determined in large part by those considerations. What Prime Minister Netanyahu is dealing with is how to deal with an ascendant centrist movement that cares about domestic issues, particularly the fact that ultra-Orthodox segments of the population don't fully engage in all aspects of Israeli state society, like the army, etc. And parties representing that very group of ultra-Orthodox. Although he doesn't necessarily have to pick and choose between whether to include the ultra-Orthodox or not, that is one of the possibilities. In terms of who foreign minister might be, it honestly could be anybody, but one interesting idea that has been floated was to give someone like Tzipi Livni, former opposition leader, a portfolio specifically on the issue of dealing with the Palestinian question. I mean, I think that would be something we would welcome, so long as it was not window dressing, something meaningful. And, Tzipi Livni certainly is someone who has said, and we believe truly believes, meaningful things about how to progress towards a two-state resolution. But, to just step back a minute and look at the whole context of the Israeli election, it was very much about domestic issues, not about the Palestinian question. But that having been said, even when Prime Minister Netanyahu forms his new coalition, it's going to be fairly fragile. And that's a situation where you will see both the ascendant centrist leader, Yair Lapid, jockeying for a run as Prime Minister himself in elections which could be, just a few months to maybe 18 months away. And that's a political situation that, despite where the individuals in the government are, including the Prime Minister himself, on their personal intent to deal with the Palestinian problem, it's a situation where a strong United States president in his second term, with the backing of the international community and understanding that he has the backing of his own domestic community which follows this issue, could make a real impact in motivating all of those actors to negotiate seriously towards a two-state resolution.
Thank you. Yes.
Yeah, what you're feeling about the disarray within the Palestinian community, the loss of power for the Fatah organization compared to the Hamas organization. That's number one. And number two, the radicalization of the so-called Arab Israeli citizen. And I say that facetiously because their citizenship is kind of second class.
On the issue of the Fatah-Hamas split, and it is complicated, and we don't know which way reconciliation would cut if it actually comes to fruition. As you may know, there are ongoing talks that have been going on for nearly 2.5 years now, facilitated largely by Egypt, both under its old government and its current government, to have the two parties, Fatah, which controls the West Bank, and Hamas, which controls the Gaza Strip, to form a unity government. There are those who say that that unity government would be less likely to want to negotiate towards peace because it includes Hamas. I don't agree with that view. First of all, Hamas already recognizes the Palestinian Liberation Organization, the PLO, as the sole legitimate international representative of the Palestinian people. And the PLO is empowered and has been negotiating at times in the past 4 years towards a two-state resolution. And President Abbas, in the words of former Israeli Prime Minister Ehud Olmert, is a genuine partner for peace and does want to conclude it, although he faces tremendous domestic constraints. I also think that it is possible to proceed with negotiations with the PLO and a Palestinian Authority that does not include Hamas. And as those negotiations progress, and if they are successful, if the Palestinian people start to see real progress towards a two-state resolution, and ultimately even an agreement, that would tremendously shift the power in the moderates' favor. Palestinians are overwhelmingly a well-educated, rational people who want the best for their children and a state of their own and a future that is secure. If they see real progress towards a two-state resolution, Hamas will lose nearly all of its support, such as it is right now, and be left as a radical rump that will eventually fade or be hunted into extinction the way radicals in Northern Ireland have following conclusion of that peace process. So I do not think reconciliation is either a help or a barrier to a two-state resolution. But what is very serious, as you noted, is the waning power of Abbas to be the representative of his own people. And believe it or not, that's something the Israeli government is acutely aware of. At times the Israeli government does things like suspend tax transfers that it's supposed to give by law to the Palestinian Authority so they can pay their bills. And after the UN, they suspended them for a few months, but then they have started transferring them again, and even advanced the Palestinian Authority some of that money months in advance. That shows that the Israeli government itself, despite policies which do undermine Abbas among his own people, don't want to see him leave the scene because they know the alternative is much worse for them.
Okay, yes.
Say that President Obama does launch some sort of initiative, whether it's during his visit to Israel or later. What do you see J Street's role as being in the aftermath of that announcement? Do you see J Street contributing to the debate, trying to shape parameters, or just supporting the president? What would J Street do?
I mean, we would be the war room for the majority of Jewish Americans who want to see this done. I mean, and we would treat it like the most serious election campaign ever, because, and we do to some extent already, to get him to the point where he will take that initiative, because our community is convinced that if it doesn't happen in this 2 to 4 year window, we may not get another shot at it. And yes, I know people have been saying, for 20 years people have been saying this is our last chance for a two-state resolution, this last chance. This may not be the last chance, but we all know what the situation on the ground there is. It's awful. It's honestly the worst it's ever been. You could say the intifadas were definitely worse in terms of the violence and all that, but this looks like it could slide into a very violent period, which could be worse, but more importantly, the long-term consequences would be permanent. The two-state solution is lost now. It does not look like it could come back. We couldn't wait 10 years, and come back to it. This would pretty much be the end. So we are already gearing up to let the president know, do everything we can to let the president, the administration, the people around him know they have the political space. We're organizing in our communities to get the Jewish Americans who agree with us when they're asked the question to actually get up and communicate that to their elected officials. And that's the key thing. No matter what issue you work on, immigration reform, gun control, anything, it's about getting people who agree with you to actually do something about it. Now, because the situation is so dire, our work is cut out for us, and Jewish Americans are coming forward in droves to want to add their voice to the conversation. But that still doesn't mean that we can sit around. We have to keep focusing on what we're doing.
Let's see, over in the back there.
I'm not a student. I came here as an Israeli emissary, and I'm working for the Jewish community here in Colorado. First of all, a short comment. I want to say that just like you mentioned, 70% of the Jews in North America are for two-state solutions. Also in Israel, the vast majority in Israel is for two-state solution, and the last 5 governments were pro it. The question is, what are whether we have courage enough leaders to head us to it, and what are the right conditions to do it, but still it was important for me to mention it. My question to you is, I live on the border with Gaza. For years, since my kids were born, we know in 15 seconds how to go into shelters whenever we get a missile from Gaza. Gaza is not occupied. What is your interpretation for it? There is no occupation in Gaza. And many of the Israelis are looking on the situation in Gaza and are saying, we withdraw from Gaza, no occupation, and look what we got, what will happen in the West Bank. So I'm just wondering how you see.
Well, first of all, thank you for your comment. The security situation for Israelis living right around Gaza is extremely dire, extremely serious, and it's one of the reasons that J Street spends a lot of time supporting efforts like Iron Dome to try and make those communities as secure as possible. This situation in Gaza, I think, is a perfect example of why a two-state resolution has to be, in the end, negotiated. It was, while I think a lot of us, celebrated the notion of getting the settlers out of Gaza in 2005 unilaterally, what that taught us, in contrast to the peace with Jordan and Egypt, is that unilateral actions, though they may appear to be moving in the right direction, aren't necessarily helpful to the cause of advancing peace, because there was no agreement about what that meant. Israel pulls out of Gaza, and you can argue about the nature of the blockade it's set up around it to try to prevent weapons from going in and to some extent missiles from coming out. But what that episode taught us is that there is going to be no security unless there is a negotiated end to the conflict. And I think this also touches upon, and I'm sure someone will want to raise the issue of, support for Palestinian efforts at statehood in the absence of a negotiated agreement. From our point of view, it is so essential that any steps be taken bilaterally as opposed to unilaterally. And right now, as people from the left to the right in Israel and here discuss, what do we do about Area C? You know, should Israel just leave these Palestinian administered areas, renounce claims to them, but consolidate what it already has in the West Bank? That would be a disaster, and the reason we know it would be a disaster is because of the lessons we learned from Gaza. The only way to ensure Israeli security and ensure that the Palestinians actually are able to develop the state in a way which is meaningful and has a chance of providing prosperity for their own people is to do it through a negotiated or a resolution that is agreed in the end and not unilaterally.
There was a hand over here. Yes.
How does this J Street work with Palestinian Americans and Palestinian activists and groups and,
Can you hear the question over there? Okay.
So J Street is happy to work with everyone, regardless of background, and supports a two-state resolution. And I'm happy to say that we have a number of Arab American and Palestinian American partners in Washington that do that. American Task Force for Palestine, though we don't agree with them on everything, are people that we're happy to hold events with. Arab American Institute, run by Jim Zogby, a fabulous organization. We work with them on areas of common interest. And we have many friends in the region itself, in the West Bank, we bring members of Congress to visit. We bring our national leaders to visit and get their perspective on things. And those kinds of people-to-people exchanges, both at the advocacy level, but on the ground as well, are absolutely essential to this. One of the questions we often get from people on the right wing of our community is, well, where is the Palestinian version of J Street? But there's dozens of them. There are dozens of Palestinian and Arab American versions of J Street. It's just that, and people on both sides of the conflict are guilty of this, no one takes the time to educate themselves about what the other side is actually trying to achieve. And so, to answer your question, yes, there are people we work with and we're delighted to have their assistance.
Yes.
I'm just wondering, with the Political Action Committee, obviously you've been quite successful in attracting funding. Where have you sort of seen most of that coming from? Is it kind of grassroots, individuals, or big businesses? And also, I was curious, I don't know about it, but just in terms of the statistics that you've given on opinion amongst the Jewish community, how do you explain the dominance of this vocal minority up until this point?
I'm going to forget some of your questions, so just remind me when I come back to them. Let's start with the PAC question. First of all, let me point out by saying that it is very easy to get on a member of Congress's radar through the political contribution process. The maximum amount an individual American can donate to a political campaign for a particular member of Congress is $5,000 per election. So that means you can actually donate $10,000 to someone per cycle, one for the primary, one for the general, even if they don't have a challenger. I think I got that right. Am I thinking of the PAC?
Other way.
25. I'm sorry, you're right. I was thinking of PAC contributions because my mind is in PAC land. Individuals, 25. Political action committees, 5,000. But you don't need to do that. A $200 donation to a candidate for a House seat will get you noticed. Now, having said that, and encouraging all of you, when it's feasible for you to do so, to be engaged in politics at all level, the vast majority of campaign money in Washington and through PACs, including our PAC, come from wealthy individuals who spend a lot of their discretionary income on donating to members of Congress whose views they support. We call these people max-out donors, people who kind of reach the federal limit, depending on how you donate, $170 or whatever $1,000 for a couple. People who give a lot of money, and because that's the way it's been for so long, that members of Congress know the few key individuals who donate to them on particular issues, it's very important that we also cultivate that kind of level of donor. And we've been quite successful at it. So in terms of the donors, we started out with people who had already given to members of Congress for years, and when they essentially approached a member of Congress and talked to them about this new group, J Street, more than half the time the reaction was, "You're with J Street. I thought you were giving me money because you were affiliated with the other guys." There's this sudden realization in Congress that the American Jews are not a monolithic bloc, and to the extent they are, it's contrary to the view they've been hearing. So that's as much as I remembered of your question. What were the other components?
Well, it's kind of combined, I guess. Just who are the primary sort of funders of the political action committee, and then the issue of how this vocal minority came.
The vocal minority issue. Now, the vocal minority issue is key. There's two responses to that. First of all, inertia. For 35 years, the only people playing on this field, claiming to represent our community, were people who were coming at it from a center to right. Now, let me say something as a former Capitol Hill staffer and a Jewish American and supporter of Israel. I'm extremely grateful for the first 30 years of that work. I think it's absolutely fantastic what some of the existing groups like AIPAC, AJC, ADL have done to build the U.S.-Israel special relationship. Israel would not nearly be as strong, would not be in a good position if it weren't for building that relationship. The problem is, since the United States has been seriously engaged in efforts to really conclude a two-state resolution, those groups have gone towards the right and done things and asked Congress to do things which obstructs the prospects for a two-state resolution. And that's where the shift in our community has gone more towards the J Street side of things. Now, so that's the first. The first thing is inertia. The second thing is, in this vocal minority are also some extraordinarily wealthy individuals, people who have personally pledged tens of millions of dollars to challenging the president's efforts to make peace, and have challenged not only members of Congress from the president's party, but as we saw reported in the New York Times and other papers just 2 weeks ago, are literally calling Republican senators and saying, if you do something like vote for Hagel for defense secretary, I'm going to fund a primary challenger against you. And because thanks to the magic of Citizens United, which is probably the worst Supreme Court case since Plessy versus Ferguson, you have a situation where people and corporations can pour unlimited amounts of money into independent expenditures and running their own home-cooked ads against candidates, and that money doesn't even have to go through the federally regulated campaign donation system. But like I said, despite the threat of that being out there, those campaigns don't have an impact. They don't move Jewish Americans, and at least in the last election, they backfired, and pro-peace, pro-Israel candidates overwhelmingly won their races.
Yes, Hussein.
I'd like to know what would you think about the regional role of some of the Arab states like Egypt, especially after the Morsi regime, and also you portrayed the current American administration as trying their efforts to achieve the two-state resolution. But what do you think? Do you think that the U.S. still have the same leverage, especially during the current, I would say, tensions in the American-Israel relationship after the Obama administration, like recent package of F-16 to Mubarak, which is really kind of scaring Israel, especially. We know that Egypt right now is not really stabilized, so it can eventually be used somewhere else. I mean,
Right.
We don't know, so I just want to know your thoughts on that.
Excellent questions. First of all, on the role of Arab states. First of all, the role Arab states have to play is absolutely critical. And I think an honest assessment of the role they have played, it's very much a mixed bag. There are things that the Arab states have done which have gone unrecognized largely in Israel and in the United States and even within our own community, like the Arab Peace Initiative. It was a very bold statement where, I'm going to get the numbers wrong, but 21 Arab states and then subsequently all 53 Muslim majority states in the world signed on to something that they said, we will normalize relations with Israel and recognize Israel if there is a two-state resolution concluded along these lines. Now, Arab Peace Initiative is an opening position. There's things in there we don't agree with, like the dealing with Palestinian refugees returning to Israel proper is something that I don't think is feasible, and I don't think something that Israel should or would accept. But it is a very helpful opening position. At the same time, Arab states have engaged in very hostile rhetoric towards Israel. They have used it as a means to kind of appeal to their own street, their own domestic constituency, and seem very, core Arab nationalist by making Israel out to be a bad guy, and that's unproductive. But it is clear that the Palestinians are not going to feel they have the ability to say yes to something unless they have the backing of Arab states. And the United States' relationship with Arab states, particularly now in light of things like, our intervention in Iraq, our ongoing war in Afghanistan, and now this absolute nightmare of the issue of how we're using drones in Arab countries and Muslim-majority countries, a lot of damage has been done. We're going to have to rely on other international partners to deliver the Arab states and, to some extent, the Palestinians. We're going to need to rely on our friends in Europe, which have better relationships with Arab states and have better relationships with the Palestinians, to put their seal of approval on any peace plan which comes out of this process. And that's the value of the International Quartet for Middle East Peace, which is comprised of the United States, Russia, the EU, and the United Nations. The question of whether the United States still has the necessary influence with Israel, I think undoubtedly so. I mean, there's no doubt that, people have been talking about tensions between President Obama and Prime Minister Netanyahu. People forget that there were tensions between President Bill Clinton and Prime Minister Netanyahu, in which each arguably tried to help the other become unseated, and President Clinton won that fight. Particularly with the new coalition that we're seeing in Israel, what Israel will respond to perhaps more than ever is the notion that they cannot do without the moral and diplomatic backing of the United States. And to the extent that a United States president puts forward a bold proposal that is backed by the international community, that would be something that Israel would have very much trouble saying no to. And by the way, this is not a suggestion that we force Israel into accepting something it doesn't want. As our friend said, the majority of Israelis, like the majority of Palestinians, support a two-state resolution. United States leadership is very much a way of providing political cover to Israeli leaders, including the prime minister, with the own segments of their population that may not be in favor of a two-state resolution, but certainly aren't in favor of souring relations with the United States.
I'm going to just make one comment. It's not so much about the details of what you've said, but it's the nature of the discussion and how the nature of the discussion on this issue has shifted over the last 20 years. If we were sitting here 20 years ago, I can assure you that the discussion would have a very different chemistry to it. We're talking today about how can we achieve peace. That's not what the discussion was about 20 years ago. And that's very encouraging. As to the details of it, what's more important for me at this point is what I can call chemistry, is getting people, the parties in motion to talk about peace. That once that happens, in terms of the details of how things are going to work out, there's a general framework over the 1967 territories and UN Resolution 242 and the Geneva process that you talked about. Those details will be, can be worked out. So I see this kind of a discussion as very encouraging. Not only at the presentation, but just the whole, what we're talking now, what can we do to resolve this conflict? This is, well, hopefully we can move beyond that. All right, is there anyone who hasn't spoken? I saw there was.
John, how would you, I have two questions. One is, what significance do you think there is to, in terms of what you've been calling the special relationship between the U.S. and Israel, has that special relationship been affected by Netanyahu's not so subtle siding with Mitt Romney against Obama in the election, which was a widely noted deviation from convention? Do you think that there are any long-term consequences to this in terms of Obama's re-election and perhaps, arguably his lack of, not only does he not owe Netanyahu politically, but perhaps even has, people talk about payback, or just simply not having to factor that into the equation anymore. So that's part one. Maybe I'll just let you answer that.
I think it was pretty generally accepted within the Jewish American community and even among members of Congress who follow this issue closely that the perception that the Prime Minister gave by saying some of the statements he did, particularly about Iran and red lines at the moment he did leading up to the U.S. election, did put the U.S.-Israel special relationship not in jeopardy, but it wasn't helpful. And, we saw very strong statements coming from people like, Senator Barbara Boxer of California wrote an open letter to Prime Minister Netanyahu publicly chastising him for those comments and saying it very much looks like you're intervening in our election. I do not think there will be permanent consequences. I do not think it irreparably damaged the U.S.-Israel special relationship or put it on a different trajectory.
But does it give Obama more room to maneuver in the process that you're hoping to see set in motion? Might he be less constrained than he would have been otherwise?
Yes. Yes, but not to pop psychoanalyze the president, he doesn't seem like the retributive type. I think he has a goal in mind, and he's going to engage in the same deliberative process to get to it, regardless of how he feels he was treated by Netanyahu in the months leading up to his own re-election. The larger question for us is whether that deliberative process is sufficiently bold.
Right. My second question was, how do you explain the phenomenon, if the sort of sociological portrait you've given us of the center of gravity of American Jewish opinion on the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, what you've described is a very odd picture in a way, which is that the center of gravity of American Jewish opinion is well to the left of where Protestant and Catholic elected representatives in the United States stand on that issue. So my question is, one, how do you explain this odd phenomenon? And two, do you see it shifting in light of developments like J Street and your lobbying efforts, which are clearly having an impact?
Great question. To answer the first part, the issue is again, inertia. Members of Congress, famously in the United States, are often there for decades. And this is actually one of the things we should all view Israel very positively about, is that they just replaced 50% of their parliament. That is a model of democracy we should all aspire to. But because so many of these politicians have been there for so long, they've developed and had deliberately cultivated by some of these groups, to J Street's right, special relationships of their own with, a handful, in some cases just one or two or three very large donors or big players in their local Jewish community, not necessarily even in their local Jewish community. We're talking about members from the Midwest. They are getting on the phone almost weekly with pro-Israel activists from New York or LA. It takes time to convince people with those long-standing relationships, who only look to a very narrow slice of our community for guidance on this issue, to convince them to listen to anyone else, even if we are the majority. But there has been, demonstrable, measurable progress in Congress. The performance of our PAC this year, where we assisted 70 members of Congress who agree with our views to get elected. And the discourse that you see in Congress is much more open, at least among Democrats, than it has been in years, where you now get 75 members of Congress saying, let's not cut off aid to the Palestinian Authority just because we're mad at them for going to the United Nations. That would be something that would have been unheard of 5 years ago. So there is progress, and because of the trajectory of our community, the trajectory of J Street and the groups which do similar work to us, I have no doubt that we are only a few political cycles away from the public perception of where Congress is on these issues being very different. Congress will still be and always should be very pro-Israel, but they're going to be much more supportive, or a much larger portion of Congress will be much more supportive of efforts like we would like to see the president launch. The problem is, and the deeply emotional wrangling that we suffer from is, can we accomplish that in time to save the two-state resolution? I don't know the answer to that question, but it's why Gordon and I get up and go to work every morning.
All right. Well, I want to thank you very much. I think this is a good time to wrap it up. Thank you for your presentation, and thank you all for your participation.
Thank you. Professor, thank you. I appreciate your comments.